Hi guys, welcome back to the Space Between. Today we're going to be talking about, as you can tell by the thumbnail, we're going to be talking about the Charlie Kirk investigation from a viewpoint of the center. So let's just go ahead and get into it. Charlie Kirk was killed in a public space in broad daylight in a moment that was as sudden as it was devastating. A young father, a husband, a man whose life ended in a way that was impossible to ignore. Not because of the politics around him, but because of the sheer human shock of it. The public already had villains. Before evidence emerged, narratives were being drafted, and somewhere in the middle of all that noise, there was a family grieving a man who would never come home. That's where this episode begins. Not in the speculation, not in the theories, not in the political tug of war that swallowed the conversation almost immediately, but in the simple human truth that a life was taken in a way that still doesn't add up, and that the search for clarity has been anything but straightforward. I want to start today with something simple, something that feels almost like a grounding breath before we step into the mess of everything else. I consider myself pretty firmly in the center. Not the I don't care about the politics center, not the I'm above it all center, not the both sides are equally bad center. I mean the center where you're trying to stay awake, trying to stay human, trying to stay honest, trying not to get swept into the extremes that seem to be pulling everyone else apart. The center where you're not neutral, you're just not willing to be drafted into anybody's war. And from that center, I've been following the Charlie Kirk investigation into his assassination from the moment I saw the headline and he'd been killed. And here's the actual 100% honest to God truth. When I clicked that headline, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know the players, the factions, the history, the drama, none of it really. I was basically walking in a movie that my friends were already watching and going, wait, who is that? What's going on? What happened? But curiosity, it's a powerful thing. And soon enough, I did know the names. Charlie, his wife Erica, the people who loved him, the people who fought with him, the people who claimed to know what really happened, and the people who absolutely did not. And what surprised me most was this. The people who seemed to be doing the most thorough, sensible, actually thoughtful digging, it wasn't the police, it wasn't the FBI, and it wasn't the institutions that are supposed to be the adults in the room. It also wasn't all the political dignitaries that showed up at his memorial. It was just a couple of podcasters. Specifically, Candace Owens and Baron Coleman. And they're right-leaning for sure. But the more I listened, the more I found myself thinking these two might be closer to the center than they even realize, specifically on the Charlie Kirk investigation. Not because they're moderate, they're not, but because they're asking questions that don't fit neatly into a right versus left script. Now, let me be honest. Do they say things that make me cringe? 100%, absolutely. Candace has this everything is fake and gay line that she loves to throw around. She has merch that has it all over it. And to be honest, as a gay person who's out here living in earnest, trying very hard to be anything but fake, the pairing of the words, it hits me a little sideways. Feels like a little drive-by insult, even if she doesn't mean it that way. And honestly, I don't think that she does. That's just me being real about this thing that she says kind of irks me a little bit. But what she is she is relentless, and she isn't afraid to be beaten up by the world for the things that she believes in. And she is getting beaten up by the world. That's rare to find in this world, and it makes me admire and respect her and listen when she speaks. Baron is articulate in a way that sneaks up on you. He's got this slightly country little twinge in his voice, but he also has 3 active law licenses and 3 different states, I believe he said. And so he's a lawyer and he's very intelligent, and he'll be building this beautifully structured argument, and then suddenly he'll crash out with something wild that makes me laugh. Not because I always agree, but because the whiplash is just so human and it's so relatable. It's like watching someone trip while they're giving a TED talk. But here's the thing: I keep listening to them because beneath the theatrics, beneath the moments that make me wince or roll my eyes, there's actual research happening, actual thought experiments, actual attempts to understand what happened to Charlie Kirk, not just politically, but also humanly. And that's what pulled me in. Because what happened to Charlie grabbed my attention long before I knew anything about him. He was publicly executed, a young father and a husband, a person whose life was taken in a way that didn't make sense, not morally, not logistically, and not narratively. Charlie was opinionated. He said things that struck a lot of nerves. He pushed a lot of buttons. He provoked reactions. But in all the hours I've spent listening, reading, watching, trying to understand the world he moved through, I personally haven't heard anything, not a single thing, that rises to the level where you could imagine someone deciding that he deserved to die for it. Not the kind of hostility that turns into violence, not the kind of extremism that becomes a motive, not the kind of harm that would make someone say that man must be eliminated. And that disconnect between the intensity of the act and the content of his words is part of what kept me in this space, part of what kept me listening, part of what kept me asking questions. Because when something doesn't make sense, humans have 2 choices. We can look away from it or we can lean in. And I chose to lean in. Because here's the thing. If you're going to tell me that Charlie Kirk was removed from this planet because of the fact that he had strong opinions and his opinions hurt somebody's feelings, granted, his opinions hurt a lot of people's feelings, but here's the thing is Charlie had opinions on all the things. Any topic, Charlie had an opinion on it. And what I find, and I'm sure history can kind of direct you in this way as well, that when extreme acts of violence occur against somebody, it's usually because of like a consistent rhetoric that they have that's continually attacking one particular subject. And I just don't see that with Charlie. He was kind of all over the board with his thoughts and his opinions, and some of them are changing. So, again, I leaned in. And then something else happened, something early, almost immediate, that made me lean in even harder. Before anyone was in custody, before there was a suspect, before anyone actually knew what had happened, people were already saying it's someone on the left. Already. There were headlines and posts and whispers pointing fingers at a liberal, as if the script had been written before the facts even existed. And that made me stop. That's what made me listen harder. Because instead of letting unity unfold, instead of letting people grieve the tragic death of a young father, a narrative was being pushed. And it was being pushed fast and hard, conveniently. And I needed to know why. Why were people so eager to assign blame before there was evidence? Why were we being told a story before anyone even understood the plot? Like, literally, I think there were already tweets and all that stuff about it being someone from the left before we had even found out if he was going to make it. And then the details started coming out, or at least the things they presented as details. The released photos that didn't look like the guy they said it was, not kind of off, not maybe the lighting is weird, just straight up not him. Then the gun they said that was used didn't match the kind of damage that would have been done, not according to people who actually know how firearms work, not according to basic physics. It was like that for days. Then this thing, then that thing, then another contradiction, another inconsistency, another piece that didn't fit the puzzle we were being handed. Paving over the crime scene so fast. It felt like every time I tried to take a step back and say, okay, well, maybe this just is what it is. Maybe this is just chaos. Something else would pop up that made me go, no. Something's off here. And I want to be clear. I am not here to tell you who did it. I'm not here to spin a theory or point a finger. I'm here because the official story never settled. Because the early narrative felt manufactured. Because the facts didn't line up with the explanations. And because when a tragedy this big happens, the truth shouldn't be the hardest thing to find. So here we are. A little over 6 months later. 6 months of questions, 6 months of contradictions, 6 months of trying to piece together a story that still doesn't make sense. And what do we have? A young man on trial for his life. A widow, now leading a political nonprofit, a shift that, given the timing and the circumstances, is hard not to look at twice. And her children, growing up without their father. And despite all of that, despite the hearings and the headlines and the endless speculations, we are no closer to the truth. No closer to understanding the who or the why. We're no closer to that Scooby-Doo moment where the gang pulls the mask off the villain in the last 30 seconds of the episode and everything finally clicks into place. Instead, it feels like we're stuck in the middle of the episode. The part where the clues don't line up, the suspects don't make any sense, and the hallway doors, they just keep opening and shutting with no one actually catching anyone. And here's the part I don't love admitting, but I think a lot of people, they probably feel it, even if they don't say it out loud. I honestly don't know that we'll ever get to the truth about what really happened to Charlie that day. It feels like an investigation that's set up to fail. Not because the people that are involved in investigating are incompetent, but because there are too many strings to pull, too many players with something to lose, too many places where the trail goes cold right when it should heat up, and then there are the red herrings. For those of you who don't know, a red herring is basically a distraction dressed up as a clue, something that looks important, feels important, demands your attention, but ultimately leads to nothing. It's the narrative equivalent of someone pointing behind you and saying, "Look over there," while they quietly switch your drink with the one with poison in it. And in this case, there are a lot of those. Too many, if I'm being honest. Maybe that was part of the bigger plan too, to bury the truth under so many half-clues and contradictions that no one can tell what matters anymore. Let's just make the whole thing so tangled that even the people trying to follow it start to doubt their own instincts. But then I find myself asking the harder question, the one that sits in the back of my mind like a weight. What happens if we do find out? What happens if someone uncovers something real, something undeniable? Something that can't be spun or ignored or explained away? Do we actually believe our justice system would do something to make it right? Do we believe that big government, the same machine that protects itself at all costs, would take itself down if there were irrefutable proof of wrongdoing? That's where the center gets uncomfortable. Because being centered doesn't mean being naive. It doesn't mean pretending institutions are always honest or always competent or always willing to hold themselves accountable. It means looking at the situation without flinching. It means acknowledging the possibility that the truth might exist and still never see daylight. It means sitting with the reality that justice isn't guaranteed just because something is wrong. Maybe, just maybe, the entire truth that comes out because of the Charlie Kirk assassination isn't going to be the one that we keep hoping for. Maybe it's not the dramatic reveal, the masked villain, the final puzzle piece that suddenly makes everything make sense. Maybe the truth we're learning is the one that's already right there in front of us. That this stinks. That it wasn't right. That the story we've been handed doesn't line up with the facts we've been shown. That the investigation feels fractured, distracted, and strangely fragile for something this public and this devastating. And maybe that part of us is human. The part that sits in the center, the part that isn't trying to win or score points or prove a political theory, maybe that part is the one holding space for all of this. Holding space for the discomfort, for the unanswered questions, for the contradictions, for the grief, for the skepticism, for the possibility that we may never get the clean, satisfying ending we want. And that space, it exists no matter where someone falls in the political spectrum. Left, right, center, it doesn't matter. The human part of us recognizes when something is off. The human part of us knows when a story doesn't add up. The human part can feel the wrongness even when the facts are muddy. And maybe that's the truth that we're left with right now. Not closure, not certainty, not justice wrapped in a bow, but awareness. Awareness that something about this isn't right. Awareness that the official narrative doesn't hold. Awareness that the center, the human center, is the only place where we can sit with that without having to turn it into a weapon. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about left or right. It's about the part of us that still cares when something unjust happens, the part that refuses to look away, the part that keeps asking questions even when the answers are slow or messy or buried. And maybe that's the truth we get. Not the whole story, but the part that tells us that we're still paying attention. So if you're listening to this and you're feeling that same quiet unease, you're not alone. I want to know what happened to Charlie Kirk. I want to know the who and the why. Hopefully we will. Let's stay awake together. Let's stay human together. And let's keep paying attention. See you guys next time.